Welcome, Ken. Glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I'm glad to be here.
So 35 years, and prior to that, you were telling me you were in Montana, which is where you started your career in journalism. Why? How? How did you choose this as a career?
You know, like a lot of high schoolers, I had an English teacher who apparently looked at one of my papers at some point and said, this guy can write a little bit, and he encouraged me to do that. And I was just practical enough when I got to college that I said, you know, being a writer is a long, hard haul, but I think I'll try journalism. And the University of Montana had a great program, still does. And so I ended up taking journalism and fell in love with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have worked for several publishers here in the Tri-Cities area with a career of 35 years, and actually you're still involved. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Do any of the publishers stand out to you? I mean, I'm sure that most of them do, but some stories or thoughts about certain people?
Well, especially in the Tri-Cities, I don't think you can talk about the Tri-City Herald without talking about Glenn Seeley. Glenn was one of the original owners of the daily newspaper. He and his partner Bob Phillip bought the Herald and turned it into a daily in 1947. And Glenn was really the driving force. And the reason he stands out to me is because I think he gets a huge piece of the credit for creating the identity of the Tri-Cities. He determined that it would no longer be the Pasco Herald, much to the dismay of the residents of Pasco.
Mm.
And he said, if I'm going to make this work, I've got to get subscribers in all three cities. They held a contest, and the winning submission was the Tri-City Herald.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow,
Yeah,
that's interesting.
I actually got to meet her on, I think it was our 50th anniversary, but I believe her name was Eleanor Moe. She used to live out on 27th and Gum Street. Was one of the winning, was one of the people who submitted the winning name.
And so that then begins the basis, the beginning of referring to this area as Tri-City or Tri-Cities?
I think that it certainly popularized it and solidified it. You know, I have to admit, I was born 2 months after the Tri-City Herald was created, so I'm a little fuzzy on some of that history, but I know there were businesses like Twin City Foods that predate that, and so I think Richland, because it was so small until the war, there wasn't a Tri-City identity. Richland was only a community of about 350, 400 people in 1940.
You know, newspaper, because I was in the television arena for a long time, people used to think about newspaper as an entity that prints money. What has changed? They're not printing as much money as they used to.
Well, a number of things. I think it was clear that, I will say by, roughly the year 2000, that a major change was coming with the advent of the internet. And you know, now if we look back 15 years and we think, wow, it's so obvious, it seems now. Well, it really wasn't. And at that point, we were the only print game in town. We had a staff of about 40 in the newsroom. It ultimately built up to about 50. And that made us the dominant news source because we had probably at least double, maybe even 2.5 times the total number of newsroom employees that all the rest of the media in the area had combined. And so people counted on their newspaper, plus it had been a tradition for a lot of years. And when you're the only game in town, you know, you draw in a lot of advertising, a lot of revenue from classified advertising. People seem to think that their print subscriptions really pays a major part of the freight. In fact, at most newspapers, while I was still there, print subscriptions really only paid for about 20% of the costs, basically enough to cover the cost of the newsprint. Everything else, all the rest of that freight was paid for by advertising. Mm-hmm. And what's happened is the advent of the internet and fragmentation of what formerly were the mass media has really changed that picture, so that the advertising pie is sliced and diced many different ways. Television stations saw the same thing. You know, we used to have 3. Now on cable, I can't count the channels.
Right. But
So,
they're not broadcast channels. I mean, you have to have cable to get them.
right, that's very true.
Or satellite.
But yeah, cable or satellite or a web connection.
Yeah.
And, you know, it is, the whole thing has become really very fragmented, and sadly, radio changed in many ways. Mm-hmm. Local radio programs on many stations are a thing of the past. It's a lot of it is canned, and you hear it from somewhere else, and I think that sort of removes the local flavor of the community when that happens, and that's why it's kind of fun to be on a local radio program.
Oh, there are a couple local radio programs.
Oh, yes, there are, but
but this is the best, of course.
We have quite a few, which is, it brings up an interesting point, which is why they've had some success, but that's why satellite radio has just not caught fire.
Because it's not local?
Because they are not local.
Because they don't have any local aspect to it.
They don't have any carbon-based life units in your community.
I see.
yeah,
Well,
and that's critical.
Yeah. Here's what concerns me, though, and it has concerned me for the past decade as I see all of this happening, in that democracy is dependent on a free and available press. Free press, I mean that the press is free to pursue information and available to the public. They can purchase it or whatever, but it has to be there in order for us to be an informed society. And that really has me concerned, and I know I'm not the only one. What do you think about that?
Well, I share that concern, because I think that this nation was built on the idea that we would have a free and open interchange of information. After all, the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of the press. The fact that that's the first thing that went into the Bill of Rights, I think says something really important. And my concern is that that's being eroded, not because the freedom is being undermined, but that without a way to make the news business commercially viable, we begin to lose that. You know, and public TV or public radio can address a small piece of that, but there have been many experiments to produce newspapers without advertising, and they have pretty much universally failed because they couldn't maintain their financial viability. And the problem is I think sometimes people think free press, and they think that means that the news should be free. And yes, I agree heartily with that sentiment, but you have to pay somebody to gather the news and to write it and to present it.
Well, to verify it.
And to verify it.
Yes, because blogs have changed a lot of that, and as you know, people can write, opinions are not facts. And we seem to get those two confused. I'm going to tell you what, we've got to take a break here, Ken, because everything, I've said this before, but everything is dependent upon money. And we're no different. But we'll be back. I want to ask Ken, people think, people have said that the Herald is a liberal newspaper, and we'll get his take on that. Stay with us. Welcome back to Meet in the Middle. I'm Christine Brown. My guest today in studio is Ken Robertson. He has spent 35 years in various levels of management at the Tri-City Herald. In fact, you're still connected to the Herald. What are you still doing?
Well, I still sit on their editorial board, but other than that, I have no input into their daily news decisions or anything. They basically, when I retired 4 years ago, I was asked if I'd consider staying on the editorial board to provide some continuity, because Jack Briggs, the longtime newsman and later publisher of the Herald and one of my bosses, had stepped away from the editorial board a few months before that, and Matt Taylor, a former editorial writer, had stepped away the year before, and they wanted a little institutional memory, so for what it's worth, they have it. My basic agreement with the publisher is if I become too big a pain in his butt, he can fire me. And I get paid $0 to do it, so
Okay.
I figure they're getting their money's worth.
They can just quit calling you and telling you when the meetings are.
That's right.
All right, well, tell me if you were involved in this. There was an editorial recently, because we're in this election cycle now, within the past couple of months, I think. I remember reading it, and it really clicked with me, and that is that oftentimes the editorial board, you interview candidates, and,
Right.
and you're kind of dumbfounded by how unprepared many local candidates are for the local races that they're actually running for. Were you part of that editorial?
Chances are pretty good, and yes, I sat on the editorial board of the Herald for, well, it's now closing in on 30 years probably, and it is astounding to me that people decide they want to run for public office sometimes, but they've never been to a school board meeting or a city council meeting until they file, and then suddenly they go a few times to those meetings. And I think my favorite story about how unprepared people can be is we had a candidate running against Bill Grant, the old longtime Walla Walla
Yes.
Democratic representative, and this guy was so badly prepared that we asked him one question, and Grant had answered it, and he said, well, he said, I can't disagree with Bill on that. My mother told me that if I said anything bad about Bill, she'd disown me. So, I mean, our next question, I think, was, why are you running?
Mm-hmm.
And at times, poor Bill was helping him out with his answers, and when you get very unfit people who decide they want to run, or people who they want to legislate Washington, D.C. policy from the Pasco Kennewick City Council, it's always kind of dumbfounding to me anyway that, you need to worry about running the city or running a school board, not about what they're doing in D.C. unless it directly affects you.
Yeah. So the takeaway, I think, which is a good one, sure rang a bell with me, and that is to attend some meetings and get involved. And also, a lot of people run for single issue, and that's not very helpful for the entire community if they're just on one issue.
Yeah, I think that single issue candidates, if they're willing to broaden their approach, can be very effective and become very effective members of a school board or city council or even a state legislature. But I think that people need to have some experience. Frankly, I will say the Herald's editorial board always looks for some experience and some kind of track record that gives us some idea of what does this person bring to the table that they can put to work in the new job that they'd like to have.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody served on a planning commission, or if they've served on, say, school district committees where they helped formulate some policies in certain areas or whatever, you know, they're kind of prepared, and if they've attended meetings and they understand that most issues in this day and age are not simple, they're complex. We'd like to reduce everything to a
Yes.
5-second soundbite, but not very much really works that way.
We'd like to. I want to remind people of our phone number, which is 547-8726. If you have a comment or a question that you want to address to Ken Robertson, that would be great. You know, I went into this last break saying that some people identify, or they've said, some, I don't know how many that is, that the Herald is a liberal newspaper. Would you agree with that?
Well, I have one response and one funny little story about that.
Okay.
My response is, I used to tell people when they tell me that, I'd say, well, you know, if I lived in Seattle and held the opinions I have, I'd be a conservative. And when I live in the Tri-Cities and I have the opinions I have, which help formulate the opinions of the editorial board, sometimes they're interpreted as liberal, and so I would say I kind of view myself personally as middle of the road. And on certain issues, I'm very conservative.
Mm-hmm.
On other issues, I'm much more liberal. And the Herald editorial board has always done a very good job of walking down those hallways of opinion, which are fraught with problems, and saying, you know, this is what makes sense. I think mostly what the editorial board is really good at is finding a pragmatic position. And I'll just give you a quick example of how liberal or conservative the Herald is. We often have letter writers complain about how liberal we are, but one time someone had taken us to task for being so liberal, and we got a lovely letter to the editor from someone else who said, I was wondering if perhaps the Tri-City Herald could give me Mr. So-and-so's edition of the paper, because at my house I get the conservative edition, and I'd really like to have the liberal one if I could, please.
Oh, all of our interpretations. We've got a caller on the line. Let's go. Oh, after all that, we lost that person. Okay.
Call back.
Yeah, call back. Wow. Okay, that is. We all interpret things so differently, don't we?
Yeah, we certainly do, and the current publisher and I have very frank discussions, and he teases me about being liberal. The previous publisher and I had very frank discussions, and he accused me sometimes of being conservative. So I frankly don't know where I am. I'm issues oriented, not liberal or conservative.
All right, we've got. So he broached the subject of Hanford, and I don't want you to go today without us talking about the interesting aspects of covering Hanford. It's very difficult, very difficult.
Yeah, it's a little bit like trying to find your way around in a dark room with a blindfold and your ears plugged sometimes.
Ooh.
Hanford's very good at telling its story when it wants to tell its story. And some of the contractors over the years have been exceptional in telling their story and telling it very well, and at the same time being somewhat open, probably more open than the Department of Energy and its predecessors were comfortable with. Westinghouse Hanford, former contractor, was pretty good at that. I always have respected the people that I dealt with at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. It's easy to name names of the people that are good to deal with and who play well with others. sometimes, especially when we get a new contractor in, they're not used to dealing with hard questions sometimes. And I think they often don't realize that when you take a job at Hanford, you better realize that you are operating in a fishbowl under Klieg lights and you don't have very many clothes on. And you know, that's the atmosphere, and along with the opportunity to make good money, you have to be able to deal with the fact that you're going to get pot shots and get posed tough questions every day.
Yeah. I've always wanted them to be really, really upfront. I've always thought that it would be a lot more advantageous for them to be completely open, to be the opposite of what they are, but they've never taken me up on that.